A 911 call crackles to life. I was in the shower. My wife killed herself. The dispatcher's voice trembles. Sir, can you repeat that? This chilling conversation marks the beginning of a case that would unravel a web of lies. As investigators arrived at the scene, they quickly noticed inconsistencies. The husband, who claimed to have been showering, was completely dry. Even more perplexing, the supposed suicide victim had 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. These peculiar details hinted at a far more complex story behind Brandy Johansson's death, one that would challenge everything the investigators thought they knew about the case. Keith and Brandy Johansson appeared to have the perfect life in Shepherdsville, Kentucky. Their beautiful 2-story home sat on a spacious lot, surrounded by well-manicured lawns and friendly neighbors. Keith, a successful business owner, provided a comfortable lifestyle for his family. Brandy, a stay-at-home mom, cared for their young son. The couple met in their early 20s, married in 2010, and welcomed their son 2 years later. Social media posts showed smiling family photos and vacation snapshots. Friends described them as the ideal couple at community events. However, beneath the surface, a darker reality was taking shape. Keith's charming public persona masked a growing need for control. He began monitoring Brandy's movements, questioning her about every phone call and outing with friends. His jealousy intensified, and he accused her of flirting with other men. Brandy's circle of friends slowly dwindled as Keith discouraged her from maintaining outside relationships. Keith's behavior became increasingly erratic at home. He installed an elaborate system of surveillance cameras throughout their house, claiming it was for security. In reality, it allowed him to watch Brandy's every move, even when he wasn't home. The constant surveillance left Brandy feeling on edge, unable to relax in her own home. Brandy's family noticed changes in her demeanor. Once outgoing and confident, she became withdrawn and anxious. She made excuses to avoid family gatherings and rarely invited anyone over. When she did socialize, Keith was always by her side, answering questions for her and steering conversations. Her mother expressed concern, but Brandy brushed it off, insisting everything was fine. As time passed, Brandy's world grew smaller. Keith controlled their finances, giving her an allowance and questioning every purchase. He insisted on driving her to appointments and errands, further limiting her independence. Brandy found herself isolated, trapped in a gilded cage of her husband's making. The truth of their marriage was far from the picture-perfect image they presented. Brandy was living in fear, walking on eggshells to avoid Keith's outbursts. She desperately wanted to leave, but felt powerless and afraid for her son's safety. With no financial resources and dwindling support system, she saw no way out. In her isolation, Brandy turned to the internet for connection and escape. Late at night, while Keith slept, she would log onto social media and chat forums. It was in this virtual world that she would find a glimmer of hope, and unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would lead to tragedy. Brandy found solace in the soft glow of her computer screen, drawn into a virtual world that offered the connection she craved. Her marriage to Keith had left her emotionally isolated, and the internet became her lifeline. Late at night, while Keith slept, Brandy quietly logged onto social media platforms and chat forums, seeking human interaction. During one of these late-night sessions, Brandy met him. Their conversations started casually, but deepened over time. This online relationship became a crucial source of support for Brandy. She eagerly anticipated their nightly chats, her heart racing with each notification. In the anonymity of the internet, Brandy expressed herself freely, without fear of Keith's judgment. She shared her thoughts and fears with her online confidant, feeling truly heard and understood. This virtual connection filled a void that had been growing in her marriage for years. Brandy's online activities carried risks. Studies suggest that around 30% of married individuals have engaged in some form of online infidelity, often with significant consequences for their relationships. As Brandy's online relationship deepened, she withdrew further from Keith. The contrast between her virtual world and her home life became increasingly stark. Unaware of the impending crisis, Brandy continued her secret communications. One fateful night, as she hurriedly closed her laptop after hearing Keith stir, she failed to notice a message notification. The next morning, while Brandy showered, Keith's suspicions were confirmed. He discovered the intimate conversations that had been taking place right under his nose. The revelation sent Keith into a spiral of rage and betrayal. As Brandy stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, she was confronted by a seething Keith, his face contorted with anger. Their volatile relationship was about to reach its breaking point. The night before Brandy's death, the Johansson home became a stage for a chilling confrontation. As darkness fell on April 6, 2018, the tension that had been building for months finally erupted into a volatile exchange. The footage revealed Keith's rage as he confronted Brandy about her online relationship. His face contorted with anger, he towered over her, his voice rising with each accusation. Brandy, visibly shaken, tried to defend herself, but Keith's fury only intensified. "You think you can hide this from me?" Keith shouted, his words echoing through the house. "I see everything. I know everything." Brandy's attempts to explain were cut short by Keith's relentless tirade. As the confrontation continued, Keith's language became increasingly menacing. "It's only a matter of time," he snarled, his eyes dark with rage. "I can throw you there tomorrow." Experts note that such recorded threats often serve as crucial evidence in domestic abuse cases, revealing the abuser's intent and mindset. Brandy's emotional distress was palpable as she cowered under Keith's verbal assault. Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded with him to calm down, but her words fell on deaf ears. The cameras captured her trembling hands and the fear in her eyes as she realized the gravity of her situation. Keith paced the room, gesticulating wildly as he laid out scenario after scenario of what he could do to punish Brandy for her perceived betrayal. Footage painted a clear picture of a man pushed to the brink, his control over his wife slipping away. As the confrontation reached its peak, Keith uttered 7 chilling words. "I'd rather be in prison." This ominous declaration highlighted the dangerous mindset of an abuser willing to resort to extreme measures when feeling threatened or betrayed. Keith finally stormed out of the room, leaving Brandy alone and terrified. The night's events foreshadowed the tragedy that would unfold in the coming hours, setting the stage for their final fatal encounter. As the sun rose on April 7, 2018, the Johansson household erupted in chaos. A frantic 911 call pierced the morning air, but the caller's words would soon raise more questions than answers. Johansson's voice crackled over the line, his statement a jumble of contradictions that immediately caught the dispatcher's attention. The 911 operator, trained to remain calm in crisis situations, began to probe deeper. As Keith's story unfolded, inconsistencies emerged like cracks in a carefully constructed facade. He claimed Brandy had been handling the gun carelessly, then suggested she might have been suicidal. With each question, Keith's narrative shifted, raising red flags for the experienced dispatcher. As the call progressed, Keith's explanations became increasingly bizarre. He hinted at an unknown shooter, then shockingly suggested their young son might be responsible. The dispatcher pressed for clear answers, but Keith's responses only muddied the waters further. One of the most glaring inconsistencies came when Keith explained why he couldn't provide first aid. "I can't apply pressure. I'm wet. I'm sliding on my floors," he insisted. This claim would soon be contradicted by the scene that awaited first responders. Throughout the call, Keith's emotional state seemed convincing. His voice cracked with apparent anguish, leading friends and family who later heard the recording to believe in his innocence. But for the trained ears of law enforcement, something about his performance rang hollow. As sirens wailed in the distance, Keith's story continued to evolve. He vacillated between claiming responsibility and deflecting blame, his words painting a confusing picture of the morning's events. The dispatcher worked to keep Keith on the line until help arrived. When emergency responders finally reached the Johansson home, they were met with a scene that immediately set off alarm bells. Brandy's lifeless body lay in the master bedroom, 2 gunshot wounds visible on her chest. The location and number of wounds instantly cast doubt on the possibility of suicide. Keith's appearance further unraveled his narrative. Despite his claims, he was completely dry. There was no sign of water on his skin or clothes, no dampness in his hair. The contrast between his story and the physical evidence was stark and undeniable. As police began to secure the scene, the full weight of Keith's deception began to sink in. The frantic 911 call that had seemed so genuine at first now appeared to be the opening act in an elaborate performance. With each passing minute, investigators uncovered new details that contradicted Keith's version of events, setting the stage for a complex and chilling investigation into Brandy Johansson's death. Keith's carefully constructed narrative began to unravel as investigators examined the crime scene. The Johansson home, once a picture of suburban tranquility, now held dark secrets that would expose the truth behind Brandy's death. Detectives immediately noticed inconsistencies with Keith's account. The lack of water splatter or dampness in the bathroom contradicted his claim of being in the shower during the shooting. More alarmingly, Brandy's body bore 2 distinct gunshot wounds to the chest, a detail that raised immediate suspicion among the seasoned investigators. Forensic experts analyzed the blood spatter patterns and bullet trajectories. Their findings painted a grim picture that defied Keith's version of events. The first gunshot wound appeared to have been inflicted at close range, while the second showed signs of being fired from a greater distance. This discrepancy alone cast serious doubt on the possibility of suicide. As the investigation progressed, detectives uncovered more evidence pointing towards foul play. Keith's body was completely dry when officers arrived, despite his claim of showering. Even more damning were the defensive scratches found on his torso, suggesting a physical struggle had taken place before Brandy's death. The medical examiner began the painstaking process of conducting Brandy's autopsy. The results would prove to be crucial evidence against Keith's fabricated story. After a thorough examination, the medical examiner concluded without a doubt that Brandy's death was a homicide, not a suicide as Keith had initially claimed. The autopsy report detailed the trajectory of the bullets and the damage they had caused, leaving no room for interpretation. The positioning and angle of the wounds made it virtually impossible for Brandy to have inflicted them herself. Furthermore, the presence of gunshot residue and bruising patterns provided irrefutable evidence of a close-range shooting by another person. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, investigators prepared to confront Keith with the mounting evidence against him. The once frantic husband who had called 911 in apparent distress would now face intense scrutiny in the interrogation room. With the crime scene evidence painting a clear picture of homicide, detectives steeled themselves for what promised to be a challenging and revealing interview with the man they now suspected of murdering his wife. In the sterile confines of the interrogation room, Keith's carefully constructed facade began to crack. As detectives pressed for answers, his body language betrayed him, revealing the truth hidden beneath his words. Keith's once confident posture gave way to nervous fidgeting, and his eyes darted around the room, avoiding direct contact with the investigators. The interrogation progressed, and Keith's statements began to contradict the evidence found at the crime scene. He claimed he couldn't apply pressure to Brandy's wound because he was wet from showering, yet the CCTV footage showed him moving around the house completely dry. When confronted with this discrepancy, Keith's face paled, and he struggled to formulate a coherent response. Detectives pressed further, questioning Keith about the heated argument captured on camera the night before Brandy's death. His demeanor changed dramatically as he realized the extent of the evidence against him. The emotional responses that had seemed convincing to friends and family now appeared hollow and calculated in the eyes of the seasoned investigators. As Keith's lies continued to accumulate, the detectives sensed they were closing in on the truth. They presented him with the autopsy results, which definitively ruled Brandy's death a homicide. Keith's facade crumbled entirely, and in a desperate attempt to deflect blame, he made a shocking accusation. Maybe it was our son," Keith suggested, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's only 6, but he knows where we keep the gun." The detectives exchanged incredulous looks, recognizing this as a classic tactic employed by guilty suspects to shift blame onto family members, particularly children. Keith's outrageous claim marked the final blow to his credibility. As the interrogation concluded, the detectives knew they had all the pieces they needed to build a solid case against him. The surveillance footage, autopsy results, and Keith's own incriminating statements would soon be presented to a jury, bringing Brandy one step closer to the justice she deserved. The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed in after just 3 hours of deliberation. Their swift decision sent shockwaves through the gallery, but the reason behind their certainty was about to become clear. The final stages of the investigation had yielded overwhelming evidence against Keith Johansson, leaving little room for doubt about his guilt in the murder of his wife, Brandy. As the trial began, prosecutors presented a damning case built on physical evidence, digital footprints, and Keith's own inconsistent statements. The surveillance footage and autopsy results played crucial roles, exposing Keith's abusive behavior and contradicting his claims of an accidental shooting. Medical experts testified that the gunshot wounds were inconsistent with suicide, effectively dismantling Keith's initial narrative. Keith's defense strategy crumbled as the evidence mounted. His suggestion that his 6-year-old son could have been responsible for the shooting struck a particularly sour note with the jury. This desperate attempt to shift blame onto an innocent child revealed the depths of Keith's deception and his willingness to sacrifice anyone to save himself. When the verdict was read, a collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Keith Johansson was found guilty of murder in the first degree. The judge, citing the heinous nature of the crime and Keith's lack of remorse, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Keith was led away in handcuffs, Brandy's family embraced, tears of relief and sorrow mingling as they finally saw justice served for their beloved daughter and sister. The conviction of Keith Johansson brought a measure of closure to a community shaken by the tragic death of Brandy. However, it also sparked important conversations about the insidious nature of domestic violence and the potential dangers lurking behind seemingly perfect facades. As the courtroom emptied and the media frenzy began to die down, many were left to ponder the broader implications of this case and what could be done to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Brandy Johansson's tragic story highlights the devastating consequences of domestic violence. While warning signs were present, recognizing these red flags is crucial in preventing lethal outcomes. Experts stress the importance of understanding the escalating nature of abuse. For those in abusive relationships or concerned about loved ones, national hotlines and local support services offer confidential assistance. These resources provide safety planning, legal advice, and emergency shelter options. One domestic violence advocate emphasized, "The most dangerous time for a woman in an abusive relationship is when she tries to leave." This underscores the critical need for comprehensive support and intervention strategies. By educating communities and strengthening support networks, we can work towards reducing the prevalence of domestic violence and protecting vulnerable individuals.